With the first publication of Aleister Crowley's The Sword of Song, since it appeared in 1904, I thought it would be fun to put together a video talking about what makes this edition so special. And even if you don't buy the book, I figured it would be fun to show some rare Crowley first editions, as well as look at his creative process through his manuscripts and typescripts. Aleister Crowley began writing The Sword of Song in 1902 while he was staying in India. What was he doing in India, you may ask? Well, he was staying with his Golden Dawn mentor, Allan Bennett, who had moved to India and was studying to become a Buddhist monk. Aleister Crowley was therefore staying with Allan and studying Hinduism and Buddhism in situ with Allan Bennett and his teachers. In addition, Crowley was learning the Pali language in preparation for his mountaineering ascent of K2, the second highest mountain in the world. And finally, he happened to be reading the poetic works of Robert Browning and thought that he would write a parody of Browning's Christmas Eve and Easter Day as a way of getting away from the Swinburnian elements of his poetry. And thus was born the first two pieces that make up the core of Sword of Song, the poems Ascension Day and Pentecost. Now, Crowley would revise these two poems and the essays which make up the Sword of Song continuously through manuscripts, typescripts, page proofs, and even after it was published. And again, we will take a look at all these variations as we go on with this video. So, strap yourself in and let's take a look, shall we? So, let's begin with the first edition of Sword of Song. Now, mine has been rebound in hardcover, but the book was originally released in wraps, or it was a soft cover. And you'll see on the cover here the magic square of sixes that is reproduced on the new edition. It's a little faded, but you might also be able to notice that the title page here says Ye Sword of Song rather than The Sword of Song, which was something that reviewer G.K. Chesterton took great pleasure in poking fun of in his review of the book. This is an interesting cover because it really shows that this whole package of the Sword of Song is a book of magical importance to Crowley, and part of this is his identification with the number 666, which you will see throughout this book, and it's in fact plastered on the very front cover. Moving along, we can get to the title page, and we see the red and black ink which will appear throughout the book. And also, just for a sense of scale, I mean, here's my hand. So this is a pretty good-sized book, a nice big paper. I may also point out the publication date of 1904. So this book, again, being written and revised from 1902 through its publication in 1904, gives some insight into where Crowley's head was at the time that he received the Book of the Law in 1904. So as a summary of Crowley's thinking and ideas about religion and Buddhism and Hinduism and agnosticism and Christianity and so on, this is, again, a very important volume. The first poem, Ascension Day, kind of gives us an idea of how this is laid out. Again, you see this red and black text. You've got shoulder notes here in red, ridiculously large margins on this beautiful paper, and so just a real sort of deluxe presentation here of the material. I mentioned that the idea of 666 recurs throughout the book, and here we see that the 666th line of Ascension Day is highlighted in red ink. And in fact, we'll see the same thing with line 666 of the poem Pentecost. So again, Crowley is kind of drawing attention to this identification here. We also see, and just from a book production standpoint, it's kind of interesting that the notes, or the end notes, appear at the end of the two poems, but with quite a lot of material left to be covered, so it's not really at the end of the book per se, which is kind of an odd placement. But you see once again that we have the red and black ink throughout, and each of the notes has kind of a reference in red to the text being commented on. And so here we see, after the endnotes, we find appendix number 1, the free characteristics. And that's followed again by appendix number 2, Ambrosiae Magi Hortus Rosarum. But then we have, after that, other essays, such as Bereshith, an essay in ontology, which is not considered an appendix, but it's just something else that's kind of tacked on. So that makes the whole organization of this book a little peculiar. And we get more complications introduced when we get to its reprint in the collected works, which we'll get to next. Here we have a first edition of Aleister Crowley's collected works, bound in black camel hair wraps and printed on India paper, which is very, very thin and fragile, so not a lot of copies of this book have survived. This is volume 2 of Crowley's collected works, which came out in 1906. Now, what's remarkable about this is that Crowley is 30 years old at this time and putting out his collected works of poetry in 3 volumes. The first volume came out in 1905. This is 1906 for volume 2, and volume 3 came out in 1907, the following year. This is the essay competition copy, which was sent to people who wanted to participate in the essay or the competition for the best essay on Crowley's collected works. The other thing that's significant about the 1906 publication date is that this is only 2 years after Crowley published The Sword of Song. And we see Crowley's editorial hand revising the book yet again for this publication. So let's take a look. Like the rest of Crowley's collected works, in comparison to the first edition, the type here is very cramped and small, very tight margins, so none of that luxurious space and beautiful typesetting that you see in the first edition. There's also, this is set out for practicality. Crowley was trying to cram as much stuff as he could into these 3 volumes as possible, so there's really no design aesthetics, none of that rubricated text that we saw in the first edition. We also see that with these poems, Crowley has added footnotes that were not present in the original text to explain some things that perhaps were less clear. So there's new material that's part of this version in the collected works. And likewise, there are new endnotes being added as well. And the endnotes here are just ridiculous. For instance, here we see that the very first endnote for Ascension Day is actually an essay. So if you're looking for the second endnote, you need to kind of flip through, find the end of the essay, and this is still the essay, before you get to the next section. And the same thing happens as you continue to go through the endnotes here. Oh, here's the essay pencil, which goes on. So you got William Shakespeare, you've got pencil. I'm like, okay, well, where's the next part of the notes? So it makes navigating these endnotes really, really difficult. Here we go. We're finally getting to the end. So I've got a few more endnotes here, and then suddenly, we see the same as we go on. There's more of these essays, the initiated interpretation of ceremonial magic, and then that goes on for several pages. So if you're trying to locate something and see what's being endnoted, it's really darn inconvenient, and that's why in my edition I moved these essays to the actual appendix. And that only makes these essays easier to find, but also makes the endnotes easier to navigate. Another thing you'll notice, and this is actually a couple of interesting factoids here, is that the After the end of the endnotes, the very next essay we see is Ambrosiae Magi Hortus Rosarum. So two things I'd like to point out about this. One is that you may notice that this is no longer designated an appendix. It's just another essay that follows in the book. The other detail you might notice, if you remember the earlier clip, is that Ambrosiae Magi Hortus Rosarum was initially Appendix 2 in the first edition, and 2 years later in Crowley's collected works, he has actually made it the first essay that follows. So the sequencing of the contents of the book's contents have changed. And another thing that's interesting is once we get to Science and Buddhism, the last essay in Sword of Song, we get another essay, The Excluded Middle, and that is followed by yet another essay, Time. And we know this is intended to be part of Sword of Song because this whole collection ends with the epilogue from Sword of Song. So 2 years after publishing the book, Crowley has significantly expanded the text with additional endnotes, with all these essays embedded into them, as well as 2 other essays appended to the back of the book. So what I've wound up doing with this edition of Sword of Song is treating the text in works as Crowley's definitive or preferred text, but try to go back to the layout and presentation, as much as possible, of the first edition with the rubricated texts and all of that. And that brings us to the next book in our walkthrough. When I say that the Kamuret Press edition of Sword of Song is the first time the book was reprinted since its initial publication in 1904, I am intentionally not counting this edition of the Sword of Song, which was published in 1974 by the Gordon Press of New York. They put out a series of Crowley's early poetic works at this time, Sword of Song being one of them. But the reason I don't count this is that basically what you are getting here is just a photo offset reproduction of what's in collected works. And not only that, it contains only the poems and the endnotes to the poems, and therefore it's incomplete. So it's not really a full it's not a publication of the full text. It's just those first 2 poems, and it leaves off all those supplementary essays and the notes that go with those. This is, however, interesting historically speaking, because if you do pick up my edition of the Sword of Song, one of the things that you'll see in the introduction is a reproduction of Crowley's handwritten prospectus for an edition of the Sword of Song. And one thing he wanted to do at some point was to put out a cheap reprint at a very low cost, so to make it available to a lot of people, because Crowley's books tended to be, fine productions with a price to match. But he wanted to do a cheap edition of the Sword of Song that consisted only of the 2 poems. So in kind of an ironic twist, this Gordon Press edition winds up realizing Crowley's vision for a cheap edition of the poems in Sword of Song, Ascension Day and Pentecost, even though this edition was, again, after Crowley's death, and he had nothing to do with it, and it wasn't the sort of cheap and easily accessible edition he was hoping for, because this printing is actually, again, one of the harder to find bits of Crowleyana out there. So this then brings us to the modern day with this brand new publication of Aleister Crowley's The Sword of Song, with me doing the editorial heavy lifting with the book. So we see the front cover and also the back cover reproduce the magic squares that were featured so prominently on the cover of the first edition. We also see that we've preserved the rubricated text, the red and black ink that is found in the first edition. So we've tried to keep true to Crowley's kind of luxe version of the book. In the contents, what I have done is treated the version of Sword of Song as it appears in works as Crowley's preferred text. So what that means is that the order of the papers that are given here follows works rather than the different sequencing that we see in the first edition. Also, this includes the 2 essays that were added to works, The Excluded Middle and Time. And the other major change that I instituted was to move all those essays that Crowley had embedded into his endnotes and just made those appendices to make them easier to find, and again, to make the endnotes easier to navigate. The endnotes are quite extensive. As you see, they begin on page 273 and end on page 401. Consistent with the first edition, the notes have the red text with the little tag indicating what part of the text is being referenced. And also the running heads at the top of the page. This is a really nice touch, and I have to give a shout out to our typesetter for accommodating this. But the running heads also help you see what section of the book you're looking at the notes for. So here we're seeing notes for Ascension Day. As we move on, we see notes for Pentecost. Here covered at the top. Ambrosiae, Magi, Hortus, Rosarum, and so on. And then all that finished off by an index. One of the things that's kind of cool about this edition is that, and this is also the thing that slowed me down in getting this book done, was that this edition incorporates and acknowledges the many revisions and edits that Crowley made along the way to this book. So not only in his manuscripts and typescripts, but also in the marginalia of his copy of the Sword of Song. And one of the rather neat things, just to give you an example, is that the poem that begins the book, where is that? Here we go. "You are sad," the knight said in an anxious tone. This was originally not about a knight or the White Knight, the White Knight being a reference to not only to Alice in Wonderland, but also to Alan Bennett, Crowley's mentor in the Golden Dawn, to whom this book is dedicated. This was originally a story about Humpty Dumpty, and Crowley revised it to, kind of reflect, his dedication. So the endnotes actually include Crowley's original version of this opening poem, and that's just for starters. Aleister Crowley's various manuscripts and typescripts, which make up the Sword of Song, are bound together and preserved in the holdings of the Aleister Crowley papers, located at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. This provided a very rich resource for the endnotes and other annotations I wanted to make to the book, and that it allowed me to document the various changes, deleted lines, added lines, and so on that I found throughout this volume. And so here I want to just give you a little bit of a overview of some of the things there. So this page here shows the poem that's on the reverse title. If you remember, I mentioned that poem which references the knight, and here we see it begins, "You are sad," the knight said, in an anxious tone. But we also find the canceled version as well, which begins, "What book are you reading?" said Alice. "The Sword of Song," said Humpty Dumpty. So that's, again, just one example of some of the many changes that Crowley made and which are documented in this new edition of the Sword of Song. We see that in the manuscript here of Ascension Day, that Crowley struck out lines, and that there's this instruction to add this new material that he wrote on page 2 alpha. And so we find more material on page 2 alpha, but also 2 beta, 2 gamma, 2 delta, and so on. So the amount of material that was added is considerable. So when we say that Crowley wrote Ascension Day or Pentecost on this date, he wrote like the bare bones of the poem, and again was continuously adding new verses and new lines and so on as he continued to work on the book. And my introduction has a table which lists which parts of those poems were original to the first drafts, which were added at later stages. So if you're really into the archaeology of this book, you will find that those 2 pages to be of immense, tables to be of immense value. Here we see an example of Crowley's essay, William Shakespeare. Again, you might recall that this was one of the very first essay, basically, that Crowley crammed into his endnotes in the Works version of Sword of Song. But what's kind of interesting is that you see here that the original title of the essay was Shakespeare, Freethinker and Disciple of George Bernard Shaw. So again, this tells you a little bit about where Crowley's head was at the time that he was working on this book and the changes that he made before it went to publication. Here we see some additional notes that Crowley scribbled on letterhead for the Society for the Propagation of Religious Truth, which was the publishing company that he had founded to distribute his own works after finding that going the more conventional publication and distribution route just wasn't working very well for him. We also find there are scraps of paper where he made notes while he was on K2, sitting in his tent, which is kind of amazing. And among these various scraps of paper, you'll find not only bits of poetry, but you also see things of, this is records of him making payments to the various porters that were carrying things up the mountain for him and his team, and also diary entries. So this material is just really remarkable, and that's just the manuscript material. We can also look at Crowley's ongoing revisions in the typescript as well. This is kind of funny because this is the introduction to Ascension Day and Pentecost. And you see that Crowley had some stuff he wrote. It got typed up. He crossed it all out. He tried writing more stuff, winds up crossing that out too. And kind of hilariously, I think, he just begins with, not a word to introduce my introduction. This is just a kind of a typical page of the typescript. So after Crowley had written out the manuscript, had all those changes and additions to the manuscript, we see he was, again, also cramming in all sorts of extra material into the typescript at this stage. Another thing that we see is that the stanzas in the poem were originally numbered, kind of following Robert Browning's example, but he wound up discarding that as he went along. This is the first page of Pentecost with Crowley's handwritten additions. You gotta feel bad for his typist or the typesetter or whoever was working with this material, because this is just absolutely bonkers. And the first page of Ascension Day, which is reproduced in my introduction, is very much the same. Here's an example of the typescript for Pentecost. There's one of various typescripts of the poems. And we see another one of these places where even at the typescript stage, there is insert page 10a. And page 10a is not only his handwritten additions, but also things that he's subsequently added that you can see in red ink as well. So again, many, many layers which make up the Sword of Song. So whether or not you decide to pick up this new edition of Aleister Crowley's The Sword of Song, I hope you enjoyed this book porn video, which allowed you to see some Crowley first editions, as well as have a glimpse at his various manuscripts and typescripts of the work that we're talking about here. They're all things that people don't get to see very often, so I'm very excited to be able to share those things with you, as well as my new book. So thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.